Yeah, our second speaker is Charles Walton. He teaches at the University of Warwick in the UK, where he's also director of the 18th Century Center. He has a BA from Berkeley, an MA and PhD from Princeton. He's the author of Policing Public Opinion in the French Revolution, The Culture of Calumny and the Problem of Free Speech, which came out in 2009. He's the editor of Into Print, Limits and Legacies of the Enlightenment, Essays in Honor of Robert Darnton, which came out 3 years ago, and of many articles, including one I'll mention, The Fall from Eden, The Free Trade Origins of the French Revolution, in the important recent essay collection on the French Revolution in Global Perspective. And his paper is entitled The Birth of Reciprocity in Enlightenment France.
Right, thanks, David. Yeah, it's a real treat to be here with Natalie Zemon Davis, with whom I studied at Princeton, and who taught a course on the gift, which later became a book in 2001, I think, 2000. And the ideas that I was exposed to in this seminar have stuck with me. And what I'm trying to do in my current book project is look at the French Revolution through anthropological lenses as a crisis of redistribution, and originally I was going to look at it also as a crisis of reciprocity. Now, I do think we can understand the radicalization process of the French Revolution if we look at interests. Who gets what? And distributive justice. Who should get what? And the conflicts about interests and principles about interests are not worked out in 1789 and lead to radicalization. But in the course, now why I think redistribution is a useful category of analysis for looking at the French Revolution. When I tried to look at reciprocity, it started to slip through my fingers. I think a year or so ago I gave a talk at Princeton on reciprocity, and I was trying to use it as an analytical category, and it kept slipping through my fingers. And I read a recent work by David Graeber on Dette, the First 5,000 Years, who doesn't think reciprocity is a useful category. And then I noticed that the term was being invented in the 18th century. So I took the category of analysis and flipped it into the object of study. And so what I'm doing here is a bit of an intellectual history of the concept of reciprocity. Now, we know it's a widely used fundamental concept in many disciplines today: philosophy, sociology, psychology, anthropology, obviously, critical theory, political economy, law, international relations, and increasingly history. How the term is conceptualized, however, varies. Sometimes it's taken to be timeless and universal, such as the case in moral philosophy. One thinks of John Rawls, where it plays a central role in theories of justice. Its prominence in this domain seems to have influenced scholars of intellectual thought over the past 20 years, and now scholars are projecting reciprocity back onto Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Aristotle, none of whom used the term. Cultural anthropologists, for their part, so you have the universal, timeless conception of it. Cultural anthropologists, for their part, have tended to associate reciprocity with the pre-modern or early modern. Across the 20th century, numerous cultural anthropologists used reciprocity to describe the exchange practices they took to be primitive or Stone Age. And implicit here was the assumption that somehow exchange was presumed to be driven by different principles. In the past, it was principles of reciprocity. In the modern age, it's rational self-interest and law. Although recent trends in economic anthropology suggest that reciprocity is useful for interpreting modern societies, in history the concept is just inching its way towards the modern. It has a home these days in early modernity thanks to the work of Natalie Zemon Davis, who's explored the role of gift exchange in early modern France. For their part, Martha Howell, Anne Goldgar, and Laurence Fontaine have argued for the role of reciprocity in the development of commercial capitalism and modern financial credit systems. But how far forward, chronologically speaking, does reciprocity go in the historiography of Europe? Several scholars of the Enlightenment see it operating in see it as an important to Enlightenment thought, but they tend to treat the concept in an unsustained manner. For example, Jonathan Israel argues in the introduction to his latest installment of the Enlightenment trilogy that at the heart of democratic enlightenment was a vision of a moral order, quote, constructed exclusively on the principles of equity and reciprocity. That's a big claim, but that is the last we hear of the term for the next 1,000 pages. For Israel, and he's not alone in this, reciprocity seems to be a crucial yet self-evident concept. Reciprocity's relevance for historians seems to end here at the cusp of modernity, and it falls out of the frame in studies of the French Revolution and the 19th and 20th centuries. But this strikes me as odd and even backwards because the concept was, I'll show here, born in the Enlightenment and developed significantly thereafter. And far from being used to describe primitive or pre-modern societies, Tahitians or what have you, it was initially invoked to think through the pressing problems of the day, especially political economy, rights, and citizenship. Historicizing this concept, I believe, allows us to appreciate how unresolved tensions of the Enlightenment with regard to economic, political, and moral obligations have insinuated themselves into this concept over the past 2.5 centuries. Now, reciprocity's first dictionary appearance occurred in 1762, the same year as Rousseau's Social Contract. And despite the claims of Rousseau scholars who see him developing the concept, he never used the term, nor did it appear in Diderot and d'Alembert's Encyclopédie. The Dictionnaire de l'Académie Française, however, defined it quite generically as the state or character of that which is reciprocal, because the adjective has been around for a while. But the banality of this definition belies the concept's growing importance. Not only did the term appear more frequently from the Enlightenment onward, it also became central to theories and thinking about society and the nature of society. Just to give you a sense of how things change, look at this dictionary definition in Larousse's Grand Dictionnaire of 1867, and if you turn those into book pages, that would probably be about 7 to 10 pages, I would imagine. It's a mini treatise on reciprocity, and I'll end the talk looking at that definition. Here, these numbers should be taken only as indicative. Here we have the Making of the Modern World database, and you can see that the French version precedes the English version by about 20 to 25 years. I think Blackstone was the first example of its use in English. At least that's what historical dictionaries say. But you can clearly see that we're going from, it's mid-century that it really takes off, appearing in about 16% of the works in the 19th century. This is Google Books Ngram. You can see here it's growing as well. These early instances of reciprocity are statistically anomalous. There's more print going on when they relax censorship in mid-century. So these numbers, I think, as you move towards the modern, you're getting a more accurate idea of how often the term is being used. Strict censorship here, and the official, a lot of the works that were approved around this time were on political economy and trade, where the term is first used. And I think that is significant. Yeah, they appear in discussions surrounding the treaties of The Hague in 1698 and of Utrecht in 1713. And I think this fact underscores both the commercial and diplomatic origins of the concept, anticipating its importance in political economy and international relations up to the present. There's even a book during the Bush era about the end of reciprocity, talking about international relations and the war against terror. These early uses also suggest, I think, that in early modern diplomatic culture, markets or access to them functioned as gifts. Much like the Kula ring functioned among Trobriand islanders of Western Melanesia famously studied by Malinowski, who pioneered the concept of reciprocity in the early 20th century. Similarly to the Kula ring, what's at stake in this exchange is peace, alliance, and prestige, domestically and internationally. And this language comes through in the treaties of the period, peace, alliance, and prestige. You can see those messages there in those themes there in these treaties. Now, these numbers should be taken, as I said, as indicative, but they do corroborate what historical dictionaries already tell us about the timing of the appearance of the concept, but also about its increased use over time. Though not invoked as often as liberté or égalité, reciprocity appears, that's the adjective, just about as often as fraternité, except during periods of revolution, 1789, 1848, 1917, when fraternity, of course, spikes. To move back to, and it seems that use of the adjective precedes the more constant rise in use of the noun. The adjective goes, well, it's Latin based, but it dates at least to the early 14th century. But something's going on here. Let's put the numbers aside now and look at what the meanings are and how we account for them. I think the rise of reciprocity should be situated within what Keith Baker refers to as the institution of society. That is, a society of morally commensurate individuals. The term characterized the nature of obligations that bound individuals together, individuals whose relationships with each other, at least theoretically, were not based on hierarchy, caste, and subjugation, but on moral equality. Before the Enlightenment, obligations were largely a function of rank, religion, or corporation, and the use of coercion to enforce obligations, such as obedience, deference, tribute, and taxes, was not unexpected. In dynastic competition, as in ruling, violence or the threat of it was a frequent way of reaching and maintaining agreements. As Hobbes depressingly put it, covenants without the sword are but words. In the Enlightenment, however, morality was supposed to supplant coercion and subordination as the basis of social bonds. As John Locke insisted, it is not fear of punishment that binds us, but our determination of what's right. Now, a good example of a shift in thinking about society as, from a society of orders held together by subordination to a society of individuals held together by reciprocity can be found in an abridged edition of Jean Baudin's Les 6 Livres de la République, published in 1755. It was edited by a Republican-minded magistrate from Bordeaux, Charles de la Vie. His son would go on to become a Jacobin and a deputy in the National Assembly in the Revolution. Now, Charles de la Vie confessed to having taken great liberties with Baudin's text, and indeed he did. In a chapter on war and its causes, Lévy has Baudin say, "Mutual aid is an indispensable obligation in every civil society which forms a single moral individual. Union can be maintained only through reciprocity. If this principle is violated, society ceases." That's a whole lot of weight being put on this concept. Lévy has Baudin recite the Golden Rule, according to which one treats others the way one wants to be treated oneself. Quote, "This precept embraces all the duties of society." Of course, none of this is found in the 16th century editions of Baudin's text. To the contrary, those editions stressed subordination, not moral equality. Baudin's solution to the problem of vagrancy, for example, was not aid, but expulsion. Vagrants were to be chased from the Republic by armies. Moreover, he thought that individuals were to treat each other according to rank, rather than as they themselves wished to be treated. In short, hierarchy, not reciprocity, characterized his views on benevolence. The laws, this is the real Baudin, the laws of liberality command that one consider carefully to whom one gives, how much one gives, when and where, for what ends, and the power of the one who gives. And Natalie's book does a lot with this. It talks a lot about these ideas. So during the Enlightenment, reciprocity was invoked in discussions of political economy, rights, and citizenship, and it was the physiocrats, or the économistes, not Rousseau, who employed the term in elaborating moral and economic theories. According to Le Mercier de la Rivière, a popularizer of physiocratic ideas, social bonds do not exist without society, and society cannot exist between an oppressor and the oppressed. It is annihilated the moment that the arbitrary actions of a superior force destroy the reciprocity of rights and duties. All right, so reciprocity emerges in the context of thinking through rights in the 18th century. Okay, and just to, and moving ahead to the French Revolution, Thomas Paine used this term in defending the Declaration of the Rights of Man in 1791. There was criticism that the deputies had not declared a Declaration of Duties alongside a Declaration of Rights, and this, he says, well, you don't have to, because a Declaration of Rights is, by reciprocity, a Declaration of Duties. And this view was voiced in the National Assembly in 1789. So, but to return to the Enlightenment, I think there are two, and this is the crux of why reciprocity, I think, is important. There's a tension between two notions of it. They wavered, the uses of the term reciprocity wavered between imagining it in terms of political will, something you need to do, or as natural, as part of natural law, a guarantor of reciprocal social relations. So will versus nature, but there's another tension as well between generosity and self-interest. And I think these are very important, and this helps explain some of the tensions over the next 2 centuries and also during the French Revolution. Let's begin with generosity, that concept. Reciprocity de la Bretonne, in his Les Nuits de Paris in 1789, wrote, "We have given the people and even our sages only one basis for morality, but it is extremely solid, reciprocity." And he continues, "The entire science of morality can be reduced to behaving in such a manner that not only will others not seek vengeance against us, they may also become fair through our example and even benevolent towards us in consideration of our universal philanthropy." Now, universal philanthropy is a far cry from what Baudin was describing about measured, calculated giving. Right? This is a new way of thinking about obligation. Reciprocity de la Bretonne believed that one should give not in expectation of an immediate return. Much like Marshall Solons's notion of generalized reciprocity, which he wrote, Marshall Solons wrote this in Stone Age Economics in the 1970s. Much like that, Reciprocity believes that one gives today and the effects of that are, it's the descendants who will benefit from that. So to the degree that you identify with your progeny, you might consider that future as a return gift. But the point here is you give now, but you don't expect a return, an immediate return. Now, alongside this moral conception of reciprocity was another that was natural and economic. And it was about exchange equivalence, not generosity. It attributed this equivalence to natural law. Once the fetters of arbitrary government and privilege were removed, self-interested individuals would freely exchange their reciprocal utilities for the mutual benefit of all. To return to Le Mercier, here, there is nothing artificial or contrived about the economic order. The universal legislator has not left to men the responsibility of instituting laws regarding it. This order is, to the contrary, naturally established as it must be in all societies throughout the world. This is not surprising. This is what we expect to hear from a physiocrat. In this economic sense, nature is always the same. Its aim is to tie individuals together through bonds of reciprocal utility. So social bonds here are not about generosity. They're about reciprocity, but that it doesn't take will or moral will. It just takes you being a consumer and going into the marketplace, and it will come about naturally. There was a tension then in conceptions of reciprocity between generosity and even exchange, between selflessness and self-interest. But it was unclear in these conceptions just how much political will should be involved in securing material justice. Some revolutionaries, such as the Abbé Sieyès in 1789 and Thomas Paine, believed that nature could adequately regulate individual wills in the economic sphere without the need of political will, that is, government redistribution and regulation. Others, however, believed that virtuous citizenship involved giving, even sacrificing, without expecting an equivalent return, let alone a profit. For them, civic morality depended on generosity. So you have crudely put, a Republican discourse against a proto-liberal discourse, already rubbing up against each other in the French Revolution. Now, these tensions may seem abstract. This is, we're dealing with ideas here, but they weren't. They had enormous implications for determining the parameters of distributive justice in the French Revolution and beyond. The revolution was about more than just determining the question of sovereignty, who rules. It was also about the question of distributive justice, who gets what and who owes what to whom. The tensions within reciprocity between self-interest and self-sacrifice, between political will and nature, as the guarantor of justice, expressed competing visions of societal generation. So we have a competing views about moral obligation and exchange going on in the French Revolution. And this had concrete implications for who gets who gets the goods that the state, the resources that the state has available. Should it be used for bread? Should it be used for interest on the debt? What does reciprocity mean? To what degree should people sacrifice? Or to what degree can market relations create abundance and equality and fair shares for all? Nor were the tensions within the concept of reciprocity limited to the French Revolution. They appeared in the 19th century, and to return to Larousse's definition here, Larousse began his definition, that long kind of mini treatise on reciprocity, citing a previous definition that appeared in 1835. The social order is a vast system of exchanges, sacrifices, and reciprocities. Now, just analyzing this, we can already see exchanges, even exchange, right? Sacrifice, generosity, selflessness. The two are kind of juxtaposed there, and reciprocity is somehow hovering in between the two. Which one is it? It does hover, I think, conceptually between the two. The egoist who gives nothing has the right to nothing. He disturbs the social order. He destroys it. So rights are not just about natural law or empathy, but they're also transactional. You have to give to get in thinking about rights. So in this definition, Larousse wavers. He identifies this tension between will and nature at the core of and he twists himself into knots trying to distinguish between the voluntary and natural foundations of reciprocity. He says there exists an indissoluble bond of reciprocity between all men, either through voluntary individual initiative or through the nature of things. And then the rest of the essay is he develops each of these two propositions. On the one hand, nature drives individuals to produce in order to exchange, and natural reciprocal exchange is opposed to unnatural competitive exchange, and this is important. This is a flip from the 18th century. He's saying capitalism is unnatural, and the natural order will lead to a more kind of social, more of a socialist kind of exchange. And finally, he says, in reciprocity, profit cannot exist. He also, however, criticizes Proudhon and Marx. He thinks Proudhon is naive for thinking that you can have a society without a state, and he thinks Marx is, the Marxists are naive, or the communists are naive for thinking that a state can regulate exchange completely. So where does this leave him? He condemns capitalism and socialisms and communism. Where are we supposed to go with reciprocity then? Then he just rolls out the Republican platitudes about public instruction, the rule of law, blah, 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 everything you expect a Republican to say. So to conclude, I'm not sure. Now, a lot of these ideas get transposed into cultural anthropology in the 20th century. The echoes of these tensions reappear, but that's another story. But I'm undecided about whether this historical unpacking of the concept of reciprocity should lead us to the conclusion that, as David Graeber insists, the term is too fraught or too expansive and too vague to be useful. That said, I do think the history of the concept helps us to be mindful about how it carries within it struggles stretching back to the Enlightenment, over distributive justice, over how society should manage the possession and flow of wealth and resources, who gets what, who owes what to whom. At the very least, a history of reciprocity should open up fresh approaches into interpreting revolutions since the 18th century, discerning within them struggles to reconcile interests and obligations within a paradigm of democratic justice.